It started with a scream, not from the hatchlings, though they were plenty loud. It came from Professor Skith, an honored member of the Interstellar Academy's xenobiological faculty, who had been observing the eggs when the first one cracked open and promptly lunged at him. Security shields hissed to life, slicing cleanly between Skith's quivering limbs and the snout of the second hatchling. Blood, green and frothing, spattered on the containment glass as Skith was dragged out of the chamber with 4 shallow punctures on his lower appendage. "They're prematurely predatory," someone shouted. A siren blared across the biohabitat. Inside the sealed nursery, 5 freshly hatched skarn whelps, each no larger than a house cat, yet equipped with teeth and talons, designed by a rather imaginative god, screeched in ear-splitting disharmony. Clawed limbs scrabbled against the transparent enclosure walls. One of them had already dismembered the remains of its own eggshell. Another tried to chew the reinforced vent. "I told you we needed Phase 8 restraints before hatching," barked Dean Rur, pacing behind the security glass, his 6 eyes darting across readouts. "They're weeks ahead of expected aggression curves." "They've never been observed in captivity before," hissed another faculty member. The data said hatchling lethargy for 72 hours. The data was now bleeding in medbay. The room filled with escalating panic and overlapping reports of what might happen if the hatchlings breached the enclosure. They weren't just rare. They were the first skarn predators born in an academic facility rather than torn from battlefield wreckage. Even in adulthood, they were apex ambush predators feared across 3 systems. That their hatchlings were now testing the electrostatic field for weaknesses was not ideal. Protocol was clear. Post-hatch, all predatory juveniles required direct caretaker imprinting within 24 standard hours to avoid permanent developmental instability. The longer the delay, the more likely the hatchlings would grow into unpredictable, untrainable threats. "We need a caretaker," Rur said finally, his voice tight. Silence followed. Then excuses. "My species scent triggers feeding response. My heart rate can't handle proximity. My people have treaties forbidding interaction with skarn brood." Dozens of reasons, none of them surprising. It was Cam who raised his hand, quietly, almost like he didn't realize everyone else had taken 3 steps back. "I can do it," he said. Dozens of eyes turned toward the only human in the room. Cameron Everett stood near the back, in a dark Academy-issued jumpsuit with a data tablet still under one arm. No flourish, no bravado. Just an unreadable calm. "You what?" Rur stared. "I volunteer to handle the hatchlings." A long beat. "Cam, they can sever limbs. Have you read the behavioral reports?" hissed someone behind him. "Yeah," Cam said, flipping open the tablet. "Claws, jaws, territorial during feeding, early imprinting, crucial. I've worked with cheetah cubs in rehabilitation programs. This isn't that different." "They don't disembowel their mothers during birth," snapped Skith from a med screen, still pale from blood loss. Cam gave a faint shrug. "Ever raised a toddler? Bite phases are no joke." No one laughed. Someone dry retched. Rur muttered something in his native dialect that translated loosely to, "May the moons record this madness." An hour later, Cam stood outside the hatchling enclosure, suited in a reinforced biosuit with thermoregulators and reinforced forearm guards. 2 medtechs hovered nearby with trauma kits. The internal monitors recorded the hatchlings circling restlessly. He stepped through the airlock. The first thing that hit him was the smell, hot, damp, and thick with protein-rich mucus. Then, the sound. The hatchlings didn't just chirp or growl. They buzzed with a resonant hum, like an electric storm trapped in flesh. One of them lunged. Cam didn't flinch. He dropped a chunk of flash-cooked protein onto the floor. The hatchling skidded mid-leap, nostrils flaring. Another one darted from behind, claws raised and halted when Cam turned slowly, not retreating but gently extending a new strip of meat. Feeding. Instinctual. Familiar. He sat cross-legged, placing more food between himself and the creatures. They circled him, cautious, limbs tense. A third hatchling nipped his boot. He didn't panic, just reached down, tapped the snout lightly, and redirected it to another protein strip. A minute passed. Then 5, then 10. A chirp, short, high-pitched, broke the tension. The largest of them padded forward, sniffed his elbow, then nosed the food near Cam's knee. The others followed. The Academy watched from behind the glass, stunned. The monsters so recently shrieking with bloodlust were now nestled beside the human, tails twitching as they devoured their snacks. Feeding time became routine over the next few days. Cam entered twice per standard day, always with fresh supplies. The hatchlings began recognizing his scent, his voice, the rhythm of his steps. On day 4, one of them, nicknamed Chomp for obvious reasons, leapt onto his lap mid-meal and scratched deep into his left forearm. It wasn't out of malice, just excitement. Still, the claws tore through the sleeve and left 3 long gashes. Cam froze, exhaled slowly, and waited for the hatchling to move before slipping out of the room. At the medical bay, the staff reacted quickly. Wound irrigation, 12 stitches, and a tetanus booster. The gashes weren't deep enough to risk muscle damage, but they were far from superficial. He was prescribed antibiotics, limited motion on the arm for 7 days, and was barred from entering the enclosure for 48 hours minimum. Cam didn't protest. He lay back on the medbed, face pale but calm. Guess I got too comfortable. Back at the enclosure, things changed. Without him, the hatchlings grew restless. Their chirps returned to growls. One tried to bite through a wall panel. Chomp threw a tantrum, ripping the bedding and defecating in the food tray. The others paced and whined at the viewing glass. Alien researchers documented everything, baffled. They are mourning. No, it's separation anxiety. From the human? That thing is made of meat and exposed arteries. When Cam returned 3 days later, arm bandaged and movement slow, the hatchlings chirped so loud the sonic dampeners activated. Chomp tackled his boot and buried its snout against his shin, vocalizing in frantic pulses. Yeah, Cam muttered, wincing as he knelt awkwardly. Missed you too, buddy. He didn't reach out immediately. He let them come to him, re-establishing the routine with care and caution. He introduced chew targets, tough polymer rings, laced with artificial marrow, to redirect their bites. He reinforced calm behavior with soft tones and food. 1 week later, they responded to hand gestures. 2 weeks in, they came when he called. By then, alien faculty began treating the enclosure as a live behavioral lab. Dozens gathered during feeding sessions, whispering into comm links and scribbling notes. Debates broke out in academic halls. Was this miracle imprinting, some kind of latent telepathic override? No, it was parenting. Messy, painful, intuitive. And Cam treated it with all the tired affection of someone who'd been nipped, scratched, and emotionally manipulated by very small, very dangerous creatures before. More would come. More incidents, more bruises, more resistance from skeptical faculty. But for now, the hatchlings chirped around him in circles, full-bellied and temporarily not trying to eat the light fixtures. Cam sat against the enclosure wall, arms still wrapped in a compression bandage, eyes half closed as Chomp tried, and failed to chew on his shin guard. Toddlers, he murmured. Behind the glass, Rur shivered. By the end of week 3, the hatchlings had names. Not official scientific designations, of course. The researchers preferred cold acronyms like SKR, 4 amperes. But Cam had learned long ago that nicknames were tools, not indulgences. Even feral kids, especially the feral ones, responded better when they had something that belonged to them. Chomp was the first, obviously. His mouth led every decision he made, often disastrously. Then there was Zip, who could cross the enclosure in 2 bounds, and had learned to scale the feeding shelves before Cam had even seen her move. Gunk was the smallest, but had a habit of drooling acidic saliva when excited. Soot had a duller scale hue and liked to bury himself in bedding for surprise attacks. And finally, Nib, who didn't bite hard, but constantly. Cam's sleeves bore the evidence. The enclosure had been refitted to Cam's specifications. Instead of stark containment, it now held reinforced climbing structures, movable sensory platforms, and chew targets made of non-toxic polymers. The smell had improved too, though marginally. At least Gunk had stopped spitting into the air vents. Cam's arm, still marked with puckered scars from Chomp's earlier incident, was mostly healed. The stitches had come out a week ago. Now, just faint red lines remained, tracing a story he didn't feel the need to explain every time someone asked. The bandages were gone, but he still kept antiseptic in his belt pouch. Teaching boundaries was harder. Not the hand, he said firmly as Nib tried to gnaw his thumb again. Target. Use the target. He pointed to a chew ring. Nib stared at it like it might attack him, then turned back to Cam's hand and nibbled. Cam let out a tired sigh, reached for a strip of reinforced jerky, and lured him away. The aliens observed everything. The behavioral teams rotated through the observation gallery, logging reactions, vocalizations, and every flick of movement. But even with a growing pile of data, most of them were still baffled. Why does he let them touch him? His skin lacks defensive plating. There's no neurochemical suppressor field. He's just relying on voice modulation and food? The debates filled academic forums. A few faculty members outright demanded Cam be replaced with something more controllable, like a reinforced auto-caretaker drone with programmable behaviors. But Rur held firm. Against most predictions, the dean had taken Cam's side, not out of sentiment, pure practicality. They respond to him, he told the board. They're already forming social structures around him. If we remove the human now, they may destabilize. Even those who disagreed couldn't argue with the results. By week 4, the hatchlings no longer bit without warning. Most rough behavior could be redirected with toys or the firm ah-ah sound Cam had started using instinctively. And they listened to him, sometimes begrudgingly, but consistently. During one session, Zip tried to climb the wall fixture again. Cam gave a low whistle and pointed down. Zip paused mid-climb, made a disappointed chittering noise, then dropped down to the ground with a theatrical flop. "Drama queen," Cam muttered, tossing her a food pellet. The hatchlings had learned individual hand signals for sit, wait, and no, come here, was still a work in progress, mostly because they always came in a stampede. But it was progress. One morning, while Cam was changing out the sensory pads in the enrichment zone, he heard it. A crunch. A very wet, unmistakably organic crunch. He turned just in time to see Chomp rearing back with something dangling from his mouth. Blood splattered the floor. Cam's heart dropped. He lunged forward, yanking the object from the hatchling's jaws. Not a limb. A lizard. Some unfortunate desert reptile from the filtration ducts must have slipped through the climate shield. Cam turned it over. Dead, neck broken, still twitching. Chomp chirped once and looked very proud of himself. "Great," Cam muttered, hauling him away. "That's just what we needed." He spent the next 10 minutes cleaning blood off the floor while 2 hatchlings tried to steal the corpse back. Later, in the debrief, he made a full report, no covering it up. They're developing prey instincts. Hunting drive. We need to introduce structured challenges or risk feral behavior. You want to reward this? Professor Avrek's voice crackled across the intercom, horrified. No, I want to redirect it. You ever raise a border collie? They don't herd, they go stir crazy. These things are wired to stalk. If we don't channel it, it'll come out sideways. Avrek didn't respond, but Rur gave a slow nod. That week, Cam got approval to introduce track lure challenges and environmental puzzles. Simple ones at first hidden scent objects, moving targets but enough to tire the hatchlings out before aggression started. It worked. Mostly. Until the bite. It was week 6. Cam had dropped a scent puzzle into the center of the enclosure. The hatchlings were swarming it, growling and chirping in excitement. He crouched to adjust the base when Nib spun too fast, missed his chew target, and sank 2 rows of razor teeth directly into Cam's left calf. There was no scream, just a sharp intake of breath. Cam grabbed the hatchling's snout with both hands and held still. Nib, off, now. It took 3 seconds. The pain was white-hot. When Nib released, the bite marks were already welling blood. Not scratches, punctures, deep ones. The suit had torn. He didn't wait. Cam limped out of the enclosure, using a support rail for balance. One of the techs saw the blood and hit the emergency override. The hatchlings began wailing as the doors sealed. Cam collapsed onto the medbay bed 5 minutes later, barely managing to unfasten the boot before the swelling started. The medical team worked fast. They flushed the wounds, administered a tetanus booster, antibiotics, and sealed the punctures with biofoam before wrapping the leg in a compression brace. It didn't hit the muscle bundle, the nurse told him, but it's deep. No standing without assistance for at least 3 days. Cam's response was a pained nod. He stayed in the recovery ward for the next 2 nights. The medbay was quiet, too quiet, after the chaos of the hatchlings screeching and clambering. For the first time in weeks, Cam was alone with his thoughts. Doubt crept in. What if they couldn't be trained? What if he was just delaying the inevitable? What if this was going to get worse? The hatchlings didn't see him for 4 days. He wasn't allowed on his feet until the swelling dropped enough to fit a mobility brace. During his absence, the enclosure fell into disarray. Zip stopped responding to signals. Chomp bit soot over a food pellet. Gunk tried to escape through the sanitation vent. The staff installed temporary auto-feeders and atmospheric lull sounds, but none of it worked. Then came the night they howled. It wasn't just noise, it was grief. 5 distinct tones, rising and falling in a haunting rhythm that echoed down the habitat corridor. Even Rur came to Cam's room that night. "They're mourning you," he said simply. Or something close to it. Cam swung his leg off the bed, pain shooting up the calf. He gritted his teeth. "Then I need to get back." He hobbled into the enclosure the next morning, leaning hard on a crutch. The hatchlings froze. Chomp chirped and ran in circles. Zip leapt onto his boot, yipping frantically. Nib didn't approach, but sat perfectly still, staring at the brace on Cam's leg. Cam lowered himself slowly, breath tight, and whispered, "Hey, missed me?" They crawled onto him like puppies starved for affection. At the debrief that evening, Cam leaned back, icing his leg and sipping a hydration gel. Rur sat nearby, silent for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Why are you not afraid of them?" Cam looked over. "I am," he said. "They've got claws, teeth, and instincts I can't override. But I've worked with foster kids who bit harder. The trick's not pretending they're safe. It's knowing when to trust, when to hold the line, and when to back off." Rur gave a slow exhale through his gill vents. "You treat them as if they're not monsters." "They're not yet. They're kids." Rur didn't answer. But he didn't argue either. Somewhere down the corridor, a hatchling chirped once, plaintively. Cam closed his eyes, just for a moment. The announcement came mid-cycle. A priority transmission scrolled across every wall panel and compad in the Academy's Xenocare division. Demonstration evaluation. Screw hatchling program, vertical bar attendance, mandatory for all senior faculty. Cam stared at the words, a protein bar half chewed in his mouth, and muttered, "Well, that's sooner than expected." Rur showed up in person that evening, flanked by 2 tight-faced board members. "The Chancellor wants proof," he said. "They're reviewing continuation funding. Behavioral viability is on the table. If this goes badly, they'll shutter the enclosure and terminate the imprint program." "Terminate?" Cam trailed off, eyes narrowing. Rur didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The next 4 days passed in a blur. Cam wasn't sleeping much anyway. His leg was still healing. The puncture wounds from Nib's bite were sealed, but the bruising spread down to the ankle, and the joint ached constantly in the dry air. He did his physio religiously. Stretch, compress, walk slowly. In the enclosure, the hatchlings sensed the shift. Cam started conditioning them to unfamiliar faces, projecting images of alien scientists into the room, using holograms with flickering outlines. Each time a new form appeared, he'd pair it with food, calming tones, and eventually, a simple game. Zip was wary of new figures at first. Gunk just tried to lick the projector. Chomp, of course, charged the first simulation and shattered the emitter lens. But by the end of the training, all 5 could tolerate strangers, at least when Cam was nearby. On the morning of the demonstration, Cam knelt in the prep corridor, adjusting his brace while medtechs triple-checked the enclosure locks. His uniform was new, fresh, sanitized, crisp, and already too warm, but he wore it anyway. Optics mattered. He stepped into the enclosure, just as the faculty filled the observation amphitheater above. Some of them had never come before. Others had only seen recorded footage. There was a rustle of curiosity behind the glass as dozens of species leaned in. Cam exhaled slowly and gave a low 2-note whistle. Chirp. 5 heads popped up from different parts of the enclosure. They bounded toward him, Zip leaping from a platform, Soot scrambling over a tunnel arch. Nib skidded to a stop at Cam's boot, head tilted. He crouched and began. "All right, eyes on." They obeyed. Cam raised his hand and pointed left. "Go place." They scattered, each hatchling running to their designated corner platform and crouching. The crowd buzzed audibly. Cam ignored it. "Sit." All 5 dropped low. He began cycling command stand, circle, return. Gunk lagged once, distracted by a floating dust mote, but corrected immediately when Cam clapped twice. Chomp attempted to preemptively leap into Cam's lap, but was intercepted with a chew ring to the snout. The finale was the test, a moving distraction. A hover drone zipped into the room, emitting random tones and flashing lights. The hatchlings didn't lunge, not even a twitch. They turned to Cam, chirping softly, awaiting permission. Cam let them watch it hover once, then raised a hand, flat-palmed. "Leave it." All five turned away. There was silence behind the glass. Then murmurs, discussions. A few stunned gasps. One voice, not even trying to be discreet, muttered in disbelief. They're listening to him. Cam didn't let the moment linger. He stood, gave the hatchlings a good job, and let them break formation. Chomp immediately tackled Zip, both chirping excitedly. He walked to the exit, didn't limp, not this time. The debrief took place in the adjoining chamber, but most of the discussion didn't center on Cam. It centered on the implications. "They're not docile," Professor Urin said, eyes narrowed. "They're socializing, obeying rules. That's not imprinting, it's behavioral integration." "And that means?" asked Rur. "It means the human didn't just bond with them, he's raising them." The room fell quiet. Cam sat on the edge of the room, sipping water, not interrupting. One of the xenopsychologists leaned forward. "How did you know this would work? What made you think they wouldn't tear you apart?" Cam looked at her for a long second, then said, "I didn't know." "You didn't?" "No, but we've been doing this for millennia. Humanity's entire civilization is built on taming things bigger, faster, and meaner than us. We turned wolves into Labradors. We taught horses to let us ride them. We even taught toddlers not to kill each other with crayons. You ever seen a 4-year-old in a sugar crash? That's a predator." There was nervous laughter from the back. Cam leaned forward. "I didn't walk in thinking I was safe. I walked in knowing I had a chance, and that if I treated them like monsters, they'd become monsters. But if I treated them like what they were, smart, scared kids with teeth, maybe they'd learn something better." No one responded. They didn't need to. The Chancellor's decision came an hour later. The Hatchling project was approved for long-term continuation, with Cam officially instated as lead developmental liaison. Ruhr handed him the datapad with the official contract. Cam blinked at the title. Developmental liaison? "They wouldn't approve Caretaker Alpha," Ruhr said dryly. "Be glad I fought them off from human emotional risk-tolerant asset." Cam snorted. Over the next cycle, things changed. The enclosure doubled in size. New staff were trained not to replace Cam, but to support him. Under strict supervision, they were introduced one at a time. Zip bit one intern's boot, and then promptly brought him a chew toy, a step in the right direction. Academy research stations across the quadrant began requesting data. And the hatchlings grew. By month 3, they were almost the size of large dogs, still full of unpredictable energy, but calmer, more measured. When Cam arrived, they still chirped, but now waited to pounce until he gave a signal. He started sleeping better, too. The nightmares of jaws and blood and failure started fading around the same time Nib learned to fetch. There were still setbacks. Gunk developed scale rot that required 2 cycles of treatment. Chomp swallowed part of a drone again. But the systems held, the routine held. And so did the bond. One late evening, Cam sat just outside the enclosure, watching the hatchlings through the transparent wall as they curled into their sleeping mound. Soot had taken to using Chomp as a pillow, which he tolerated with only minimal grumbling. Zip twitched in her sleep, chasing something in her dreams. Nib nestled closest to the glass. Ruhr sat beside him in the corridor, silent. "They're not tame," Cam said quietly. "No," Ruhr agreed. "They're not. But they're learning." There was a long pause. Then Ruhr asked, "What do you think this says about your species?" Cam tilted his head. "That we're stubborn, and weirdly optimistic. And reckless." "Yeah," Cam admitted, smiling faintly. "That too." He stood, testing the weight on his leg. It held. "They're still going to grow into apex predators," Ruhr said. "Probably. And you'll still trust them." "I'll trust what I've taught them." Ruhr hummed. "That may be even more dangerous." Cam gave a tired smile, stepping toward the exit. Welcome to parenting. The first snow simulation began on cycle 123. It wasn't real snow, of course. The enclosure's environmental matrix couldn't sustain that kind of temperature drop without causing havoc in the filtration systems. But it was close, gentle flakes made of soft foam polymer drifted from the ceiling, catching on the hatchlings' scaled hides as they chirped and darted through the misty air. Cam sat on the observation perch, knee propped up, idly rubbing the scar beneath his brace. The bite marks were still visible, pale against tan skin, but the swelling was gone. He hadn't needed the brace for a few weeks now, but the cold simulations made the joint ache. He didn't mind. Chomp barreled past Zip, diving headfirst into the foam drift. Zip retaliated by leaping from a climbing structure, sailing past Cam's head with a chirp that was suspiciously close to laughter. "Easy," Cam called down, catching a tumbling enrichment cube before it knocked over the mineral dispenser. "I'd like to keep the wall upright today." The hatchlings chirped, scattered, and started again. Rough play, not aggression. They were still growing, still unpredictable, but now they listened. Now they chose play over violence. That choice meant everything. The Academy had stopped debating the results months ago. What had begun as a last-ditch behavioral experiment was now a cornerstone of the Interstellar Care Initiative. Cam had been asked to consult for 3 other cross-species hatchling programs. His files were cited in policy documents. The term imprint care had even been replaced in official lexicons with a new name, adaptive bonding, a model based entirely on his protocols. The term Everett method was whispered in classrooms with equal parts reverence and unease. Cam found that hilarious. Still, he refused every off-world invitation. He had no interest in becoming a celebrity researcher. His hatchlings were here, his work was here. Everything else could wait. That didn't stop the visitors. Today's were especially official. Cam stood near the enclosure gate, watching 2 diplomatic envoys from the Skarn Dominion enter the corridor, fully armored, narrow-eyed, and clearly unimpressed by the Academy's architectural choices. "These are not true Skarn," one said after only 30 seconds. "They have not undergone proving." Cam stayed silent. The taller envoy, a female, judging by the shoulder crest, circled the enclosure slowly. Inside, Soot stopped playing and rose into a low, alert crouch. The others followed. Zip tucked herself behind a support beam. Nib moved to stand near the gate, not growling, but watching. Cam stepped forward and tapped the wall. "Safe," he said. "Stand down." The hatchlings relaxed instantly. The Skarn envoy blinked twice. "They understand command language?" "Yes." "They obey you?" Cam nodded. There was a long silence. "These were war beasts," she said finally, gesturing toward the creatures now wrestling in the foam flakes. "Bred to kill, to track without conscience. How did you alter them?" Cam folded his arms. "I didn't alter anything. I raised them." She narrowed her eyes. "Raised?" He nodded toward Chomp. "That one chewed through 2 inches of alloy before I taught him what weight means." The envoy made a sound between a scoff and a snarl. "You claim you've replaced instinct with etiquette?" "No," Cam said. "I added structure. They still have instincts. They still could kill, but now they choose not to. That's the difference." The male envoy finally spoke. "Why?" Cam turned to him. "Because it's the only thing that works long term. Fear might keep them caged, but care? That makes them loyal. It makes them stable. You want weapons? Use drones. But if you want beings you can live with, you raise them like people." Both envoys looked at him as if he'd proposed teaching calculus to a volcano. They left without ceremony. Later that week, Cam sat outside the enclosure with Ruhr. They rarely had quiet moments anymore. Too many progress reports. Too many research teams wanting insights. But Ruhr still made time. He watched Zip chase a moving scent ball through a series of vertical tunnels, chirping with satisfaction each time she nailed the turn. "You know," Ruhr said thoughtfully, "they'll outgrow this space within 4 months." Cam nodded. "We'll need to expand the upper tier, build a mock terrain field." "You still planning to keep them all?" "Unless someone else has earned their trust, yeah." Ruhr glanced at him. "That's rare. Most programs separate juveniles after initial bonding." "Yeah, and most of those juveniles end up neurotic or stunted. The clutch stays together. They're a unit." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Rur asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't volunteered?" Cam didn't answer right away. He thought of the first week. The growls, the blood, the stitches, the panic. He thought of Nib's bite, the pain, the weeks of soreness, the guilt etched into the hatchling's eyes when Cam had finally returned. And he thought of 5 powerful, unpredictable predators who chose to follow signals, not instinct, who curled beside him when he sat still, who guarded the door when they sensed something off. "Yeah," he said, "I think about it a lot." Rur gave a small nod. "And? I think they'd be dead, or we would." Rur didn't disagree. Cycle 200 arrived with a quiet celebration. No banners, no announcements. Just Cam sitting in the center of the enclosure while 5 half-grown Skarn lay in a loose pile around him. Their scales were thicker now, their jaws heavier. Zip was long enough to reach the climbing beams in a single leap. Chomp had stopped trying to eat the lights, mostly. Cam sat with his back against the warmth of Gunk's side, tracing new scarring along his forearm. Not from aggression, just wear and tear. Playing with apex predators wasn't exactly spa work. Soot lifted his head suddenly, ears twitching. Cam followed the motion. Outside the enclosure, a new intern stood, eyes wide, hands shaking slightly. Cam raised a hand. "He's just curious. Soot down." Soot obeyed. The intern exhaled slowly. Cam met her eyes through the glass. "You want in?" She hesitated. "I don't think I'd survive." Cam smiled. "Neither did I, but here we are." He stood with a slight grunt, dusted his knees off, and gave the hatchlings their evening command. "Place." They moved. Effortlessly, gracefully, without a sound, and the intern's expression shifted from fear to something like wonder. Cam watched it happen, then turned to the hatchlings. They weren't babies anymore. They were fast, sharp, dangerous. But they were his. And maybe, just maybe, they were more than that too. Not monsters. Not weapons. Just children who'd been given the chance to grow up loved. And that made all the difference.